to desert friends in order to appease enemies. It is worse than a crime. It is the most monumental of blunders, for it impairs the most precious of Labour's assets, the allegiance and loyalty of working people. Eric Heffer well understood the importance of such interventions because he appreciated the contribution that a socialist press could make at times of struggle. In another book, Labour's Future, Socialist or STP Mark II, he wrote that the press has not always been a defender of the establishment in this country. When papers were first published in Britain, most of them were democratic in nature, and there was a great struggle to get them circulated without high taxes which put them out of the reach of the working man and the working woman. He recalled the struggle against the newspaper Stamp Act and the contributions of progressive publications from the Northern Star at the time of the Chartists, through Justice, the Clarion and Labour Leader, and the valuable contributions that each of those made to the struggles of their day. But Tribune held a special place in Heffer's heart because it was not only a publication. At that time when Heffer was so involved, it was a political project. And he recalls part of this in Never a Yes Man, where he speaks about how the struggle of the paper against in place of strife was followed by the struggle of the Tribune Group in those days against what followed under the Tory government, which was new industrial relations measures at the start of the 1970s, where the Tribune Group steadily, one MP after another, starting with Stan Orme, rose to block parliamentary proceedings, prevent the passage of the bill, and demonstrate to workers who had dropped their tools outside of Parliament that there were people representing them from their class in Parliament who understood that struggle. The demonstration was viciously denounced in the right-wing press and even condemned by the party leadership at the time, but Heffer remembered it, and particularly the singing of the red flag which went along with it. He wrote, "It was taken up on all sides. We filed through, singing, and continued singing in the chamber. We went back to our seats, standing in front of them, and sang. I'd never really liked the song, The Red Flag, especially sung in desultory fashion at Labour conferences. But this was different. This time it was being sung with a fire and a fervour unknown to me in the past. Even as I write now, I'm moved by this event." That for Heffer was the job of the MP, to take the phrase of his most famous book, Glass Struggle in Parliament. I was pleased to be introduced today by a worthy successor of Eric's, Liverpool Walton, in Dan Carden, who wrote in Tribune last year that it was the battle for a truly socialist Labour Party that defined Eric Heffer's life. As Eric's successor in Liverpool Walton, Dan said, "I see my own role in very simple terms. I am a representative of my class in Parliament, a voice for organised Labour. My duty is to fight for a socialist Labour government, a goal which is the only way to transform the lives of my constituents who are suffering under a rampant capitalist system." It will be hard, I think, to pay a more fitting tribute to Eric than that. But I think it's important to say, as well as this, that we meet at a difficult moment, a time of defeat for our movement. Last month's election results were a bitter blow for all of us, but especially for millions of people across this country who so desperately needed a Labour government. The coming years will see, and we shouldn't be in denial about this, a renewed wave of attack by the Conservative Party on our people. Those who rely on state support will be forced to endure further humiliation at the hands of the Department of Work and Pensions. Rituals designed to persuade them that their lives are expendable. The queues of food banks will grow, the numbers of homeless will too, as Tories continue to sacrifice people's need for housing on the altar of profit built by speculators and landlords. People will wait more hours in A&E, the privatisation of the NHS will continue. They'll come for our unions. And we can't shy away from any of it. We can't run from it, we have to face it. And we have a duty to all of those who are looking to the Labour Party and who looked to the Labour Party in recent years to provide some relief from suffering in their lives, a duty to show them that that slogan that we talked about in the campaign was true. The message from socialists in every corner of this country to those who must endure those years of Tory government must be that you are not alone. When you are fighting universal credit and its destructive impact on your life, you're not alone. When you're fighting eviction from your home when you can't pay the rent, you're not alone. When you fight the closure of your local hospital services, when you're forced to watch a loved one wait in pain for care they need, you're not alone. When you fight cuts to your schools, when you worry about your child's future, when you fight back against zero-hour contracts and a boss that saps your will to live, when you stand up to the racists enabled by this government who want to divide our communities and stir hatred, you're not alone. Our movement will stand with you. We will not allow them to turn this society into a place of desperation and fear, and we will fight. One of the most important of Tony Benn's speeches in his entire career, I remember, was the one where he spoke about the greatest lesson he learned in struggle, that there was no such thing as a final victory or a final defeat. The truth of the Labour movement, if we learn anything from Eric Heffer, is that all of our victories up until this point have been partial. None of them have been permanent. And there are reasons why, just as there are reasons why all of our defeats are partial and none of them permanent. The reason why our defeats are partial and not permanent is because they rest upon a system which produces every day the need for Labour politics, socialist politics, and a different kind of government. They rest upon a system which is based upon the exploitation of the people, which is based upon deep injustice and inequality. And as long as that system is incapable of producing popular prosperity and a good life for the majority of the people who live in this country, there will always be opportunities for us to fight back, to overcome defeats, and to put the Tory government on the back foot. We can't forget either that in the last few years, the Labour Party and Corbynism as a project won millions of people over to ideas that fundamentally challenge that system. Not just a little bit of changing here or there, but questions, fundamental questions about ownership. Who owns the economy? Who controls the economy? And by what right they do so. If you compare it to 2015 in our manifesto, where we were standing on continuing austerity, matching the Tories cut for cut inside of selected areas, where we were standing not on nationalisation, but simply on reducing some bills for the privatised companies, it was a world of difference. But we have to be real at the same time as we won people over on questions like nationalisation, ending privatisation of the NHS, increasing the minimum wage, ending zero-hour contracts, putting workers on boards and giving ownership of companies to workers. Major, important, structural questions we won people over on. People never felt they owned it, or far too few in this country did. And that is a question of rebuilding our roots. Now, for far too many people, they looked at the Labour Party as giving them another menu, another set of options, as a traditional political party would. We cannot win on those terms, because fundamentally, people do not believe politics is able to change their lives for the better anymore. Too many decades of defeat for us, too many decades of right-wing politics have left people with a sense that our politics will be no different to theirs. We have to look at the question of why Corbynism as a project was not accompanied by any great uptick in class struggle. I know it is, to some people in Westminster, a kind of very old-fashioned idea. But we've gone from the point of losing, and they say losing, tens of thousands of days to strike action in the 1970s, to a handful reaching hundreds now. We've gone from a point of almost half of the workers in this country being in unions, 50% density, very close to between 40 and 50, down to, depending on how you believe the numbers, between 20 and 25. There has been a massive rollback in the power of workers and in class struggle, and that has changed in the last 4 years. And we have to ask ourselves questions of why. There is in this country a profound crisis of community, an erosion of collective that the Labour Party didn't do enough to overturn. We had not only the decline of the trade unions in community after community after community, along with unionised and decent jobs around the country, but collective institutions in general, where people were participating far less and becoming far more atomised. And with that decline of community and the sense of a common purpose with the people you live around, comes a decline in the prospects of collective politics. And people not being able to believe, which is the core part of our politics, that you can do more together, even if you don't own, even if you're a worker, even if you have to go to work every day and you live on your wages. You can do more if you gather together with people around you in the same position to beat back your bosses and the people who own wealth than you would be able to on your own. That fundamental question of what we stand for was lost on too many people because we didn't challenge enough the tide of the collective, the crisis of community in this country, the collective being eroded. And in the broader context of that, Dan was speaking about things like the Sun newspaper. We have to be realistic. In hundreds of working class communities in this country, the Labour Party was no longer a presence in people's lives on a daily basis. But the Sun was, but the Daily Mail was. And if we can't answer that question, the prospect of socialist politics going forward is very bleak indeed. We will be left into the situation where we say the only way to fight and to try to win in politics is to win some media game, where we know that 65% of the papers people read every day in this country are owned by Murdoch or owned by the Daily Mail Group. That's not a game we're ever going to win. If we allow people to be atomised, made into individuals, then they will be picked off by the right-wing press every time. So our job is to rebuild social institutions. And our job as a Labour Party, Labour movement and as socialists is to be participating in that process. And it is not just campaigns. Campaigns are important. When I speak to people in the aftermath of the election, I know how much work went in, and I know how proud people should be about how much effort they put in to try to win. And I wouldn't ever diminish that. And people tell me, you know, we did campaign over this and we did campaign over that. And campaigns are important, but they're not the same as social institutions. They're not the same as the fabric that ties people together. I was thinking recently of the example of Salford, where I was, for reasons some people in the room, I'm going to a partisan speech here, but for reasons people in the room might guess, recently, speaking to people who are active on the ground, struggling there, who had managed to win a left-wing council in Salford under Paul Dennett, where they were building council housing again for the first time in decades. And you ask yourself the question, what happened? How did it turn from a place where not too long ago MPs like Hazel Blears and a very right-wing local Labour Party, there was very little prospect for socialism in Salford, despite its great and radical roots. Well, it changed on the back of important struggles like building a workers' credit union to drive Wonga out of Salford and give people some sense that our politics is not just represented on the door at election time, it's not just represented in the news or when you hear policies, it's represented when you need it. Without that, we have a very limited prospect of being able to turn back the tide on what has just happened to us. I know that part of this conversation is on the question of Brexit, and I wouldn't shy away from it. Those of you who read Tribune know our position and what we said at the time after the European elections. We argued the party should hold the line. We argued against moving into a second referendum position. We were concerned by what would happen to our ability to speak, to even begin the conversation with too many communities in this country if we did that. The numbers on it are clear. 40% of Labour's 2017 Leave vote went to the Tories, or the Brexit Party. It was already a third down, those who voted Leave from 2015. 52 of the 60 seats lost in Leave areas, most of the rest in Scotland. And it's not a surprise. The numbers, as we pointed out at the time, were always fairly clear for us here. 406 seats in this country voted Leave, only 242 for Remain. Labour, their own party's own seats when we were coming into this election. We were looking at 148 had voted Leave and only 84 Remain. But there was a deeper question here than just how you deal with the Brexit issue, which is what Brexit was speaking to for a lot of people. Because at the same time as we lost so many people who had voted Brexit, when you look at the constituencies with the highest share of low-skilled jobs, the Tories went up 6 points and Labour went down 14 since 2017. Now, a lot of people who I've spoken to who don't agree with my analysis, don't agree with that perspective on Brexit, they look at places like Burnley and Bolsover and Bassetlaw and they've convinced themselves that because people get a bit older, they're the class enemy now. Well, I tell you, anyone who went and walked on the streets of these places, knocked on doors and spoke to people and saw a class enemy is a very suspicious socialist indeed. The truth is, people felt with Brexit some ability to reclaim some degree of control over their lives. That's the reason why that slogan was used. And the question of what it means is important. I remember speaking to socialists in Sunderland during the 2017 campaign about this question of what we do with the term take back control. And people speaking to me about the transition of that city from a place of shipbuilding and glass making jobs with a huge proportion of steady, decent work for people, work that you had a control over. Because if something went wrong in your work, it was unionised. You went to your shop steward. You knew where your son, usually, and I know that was a part of the equation, I wouldn't deny it, but you knew where your son was probably going to be working next, because it was the same job you had, which was the same job your father had. That's a level of control. When things went wrong in your local area, your council and your councillor were most likely coming from the same background as you. They'd come through the same job. You had some sense of knowing them. Sunderland was one of those places where Labour even had street captains. So dense was the degree of Labour Party organisation, where you were able to go to somebody on your own street in many areas who would deal with issues when you had them, not just your local councillor. That's a bit of control over your life. It's not total, it's not what socialists aspire towards, it's not ownership, but it's control. And the idea that that phrase can only be discarded as one of right-wing populism is wrong. It's asking the question why people felt their lives were out of control and why we didn't do more to win them over to our arguments about globalisation, to our arguments about austerity, to our arguments about the decline of democracy as a solution to it. And so we have a huge task on our hands. We have to fight to rebuild democracy in a sense that it means something to people. We cannot just take this moment and the difficulties that it provides us and go down the path of least resistance. Because the debate I see opening up in the Labour Party today, and it's a debate, I will be honest, socialists are losing right now, over the reasons we lost, is breaking down into two arguments. One, the argument I just made, losing touch with our roots and the grassroots perspective. The other, saying we lost because Jeremy Corbyn was not Prime Ministerial enough, because we were not good enough at the professional politics, we were not good enough at the Westminster politics, we didn't come across well enough in the media. It's a difference between a grassroots perspective and a Westminster perspective. If we go down the road of believing the way forward is simply a slicker operation, and to do Westminster right, we will bury our socialist ambitions. Every time. In fact, the truth of the last 2 years, particularly for the Labour Party, is that we were too caught in Westminster. That people saw us as too involved in those questions. That they saw us as not relevant enough to their daily lives and too much involved in the bun fight that was going on over Brexit. We didn't do enough to change the idea of authority in this country. The question now, when people are saying to me, and I'll go and say it straight up, people say to me, Keir Starmer looks like a Prime Minister. I understand the perspective, I do, and I also understand people who've just suffered a very difficult, gut-wrenching loss and look around them at another years, 4 or 5 years of Tory government, and say, we have to stop this. We will do whatever it takes, and this guy looks like he wins the game as it's played now. But the problem with that is, there's a fundamental inbuilt idea of who deserves authority in this country and who doesn't, that people see Keir Starmer fitting, that will never fit socialists. Not in a million years. If we say that it is unacceptable for a Prime Minister in this country to take the side of the weakest in international affairs, to stand up for workers, to not be perfectly polished in their presentation, to not be somebody who is maybe going to impress Sky News or BBC journalist, but is going to relentlessly fight on the side of working people, if that is an unacceptable image of what authority is, then we didn't do enough to challenge the question of what a Prime Minister should look like. We played too much like the old game. And this is going to feed into an even bigger question about the future of the Labour Party, which goes to the heart and soul of what the party is about, which is what is our coalition going forward. Because there is a battle here, and we shouldn't be delusional about it, over whether we follow the path of least resistance into becoming the party of the people with nice opinions, the party of younger people, the party of people in the big urban areas, where it's not so hard to knock on a door, where, to be frank, as having someone who's knocked on a door with an Irish accent in this election, you're not going to hear so much about the IRA. Because I did. And I get that, and I get the difficulty saying that. It's alright. So I'm not playing down how hard it is to knock on a door and be told you're a traitor, or how hard it is to knock on the door and get some vitriol about the party thrown back at you. But there is a fundamental question, whether we are a party that is based on a cross-class alliance of people with progressive views, or we are a party based on a coalition of people who need a Labour government, based on class politics, which means going into places that it's harder to make arguments, but where people need a Labour government, and making that case and winning people over and rebuilding community, versus the easy road, the path of least resistance, and becoming a party which, if we follow that road, inevitably leads to something like the Democratic Party in America. There is no space for a trade union link within a party of cross-class progressives. There is no space for class politics, because the lines will be drawn on questions like, are you remain or are you leave? They won't be drawn on questions like, do you work for a living and rely on your wages to live, or do you live based on your wealth? If we allow the dividing line of politics to swing in that direction, the prospects for socialism are bleak indeed. And it means we have to accept that after 2017, we did way too much of the easy thing. Which is not to criticise individuals, because I think it's the easy way out here. It's the entire movement. After the results of June 8, 2017, and the great elation, and the speech at Glastonbury and whatever else, we leaned way too much into the parts that gave us the buzz on that day, the parts where we had made some inroads, and didn't do enough to look at all of the places where we were losing ground, even in 2017, where the Tories were growing, heartland areas where it would have been much harder but much more valuable to do the work of focusing on. We became a party whose narrative, whose conversation was so much more about, to be frank, youth and trendy politics, a party that had its whole communication message was way too much preaching to the choir, and a party whose kind of form of organisation and emphasis was never one that would sustain a coalition. We became too narrow. And there is a historical precedent on some of these questions. We look back at things like the 1960s. I'm going to use an anecdote here, and it is sharp, so accept that there's a bit of humour to it. In Never a Yes Man, Eric Heffer recall the debate that he had with Tariq Ali and Bob Rawthorne of Black Dwarf in a student venue in London in 1969. It's a cautionary tale. He was defending the idea of fighting for socialism through the Labour Party and defending the idea of working class organisation and the long, slow, hard struggle. And he got a very hostile response, particularly when he spoke about his working class roots and his time as a militant in the unions. 40 years ago I worked at a bench, he said. I know more about class struggle than 90% of the people here. As Tariq Ali records in the book, the assembled crowd were laughing at him. And Doris Heffer, Eric's wife, said to the student-heavy audience at that time why they were jeering. She said, what he says is true. But the creed of a particular strand of the left at that time believed in the essential conservatism of workers and the need to build new organisations focused on youth politics and different kind of social divisions between conservative and liberal, young and old, which were going to overcome class politics. And so Heffer got heckled, he got laughed at, he got jeered for the whole night. And at the end he said, in the future, no doubt, some of you, perhaps a lot of you, will be working in the city, will be bankers and capitalists of all kinds, with your bowler hats and your rolled umbrellas. And I know what I'll be doing, I'll be fighting for my class and for socialism. And in the book he says, I followed the career trajectory of a number of key people in that room in the years after, and I wasn't far off. But there is this battle over the soul of what the Labour Party is about, between socialism and progressivism. A party that is based upon a coalition of people's interests against a party that's based on a coalition of people's views. And if we allow ourselves to slip into the easier path right now of becoming a party that simply tries to do some kind of progressive alliance with various liberals, people with different nice lefty social views on certain questions, we will forget that the fundamental alignment of politics is a class alignment. And that if we go and try to fight and win on a socialist programme backed by a substantial part of a coalition who has no interest materially in achieving that programme, we will be unsuccessful. Our path is a different one. It's a class politics for the 21st century. It is going out, fighting to rebuild this party in the communities that we lost, fighting to rebuild the idea of social institutions and collective politics. It is going and having the hard conversations. It is going and confronting ourselves about why some of our messages didn't work. And it is, at the end of the day, winning a battle now over the soul of this party going forward, which is between the left of the party and the right of the party, which is a question of whether we're going to have a focus on a professional politics that looks better in Westminster, or a politics that means more to people's lives day to day. That is the battle we have to fight, and that is the battle we have to win. And if we don't, the consequences will be severe. Because let me tell you, it does not matter in an election campaign, leadership election campaign, whether you say you back radical and socialist politics or not. What matters is, are you going to fight for them against the vested interests who defend the status quo? Are you going to fight for them against big business and the media class and the political class? And who's the army you're fighting with? Because anyone can tell us during a leadership election with a lefty membership that they support X and Y and Z radical proposal. The question is to look at their record and ask, are they going to back them when times get tough? Do they have people as part of their coalition in the party who are going to try to undo those policies? And are they beholden to them in some way? Or are they going to stay true? Do we know that they have institutions and forces in the party behind them who are going to stick by those policies and back them up? Because policies at the end are the residue of struggle. They are not simply something plucked out of the air. And I'll finish with what I think is a very important piece of literature, given the context, by a great Liverpool poet, Arthur Clough, who wrote after the defeat of the Chartists the Clough's argument was, at that time, that the Chartists have been beaten, they have been knocked back, they have not succeeded, but that their ideas were right, that they live on substantially in the hearts of the people, and that the next fight for democracy is one that they would win, and that we would win. And Clough was right. And his poem went like this: Say not the struggle not availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been, they remain. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making, come silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. And for us in the Labour Party, the land can be bright. There's enough of what we've done in the last 4 years that can be built upon, if we're honest with ourselves about the limitations, and if we're willing to take this fight forward. If we're willing to stick to the principles that got us to this position and commit ourselves to what socialism is really about, the rebuilding of a collective politics. Thank you.